exaggeration to say that Joseph is as responsible as anyone for bringing the practice of Vipassana, otherwise known as mindfulness, to the West from India. Joseph is certainly one of the finest meditation teachers I know. And today we take your questions in an AMA, and we deal with some basic questions like why meditate in the first place, and how long do negative emotions actually last when you pay attention to them. But then we get into esoterica like selflessness and the Buddhist concept of enlightenment, and topics that will only be of interest perhaps to a subset of you. And again, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, you are free and encouraged to support the podcast at samharris.org/support. And now I bring you Joseph Goldstein. I am back here for a third podcast with my friend Joseph Goldstein. Joseph, thank you for doing this once again.
A pleasure.
So we have taken questions from the internet this time around, so as to ensure that we answer questions that are interesting to people rather than try to find our way through the maze of our minds together. We went out on Twitter and Facebook and got a bunch of questions. First, I got many questions about my meditation app, and I am increasingly embarrassed to say it is still coming. It is still coming, but I have just, it's been a long and somewhat painful education in what is required to develop an app. I'm confident that we will beta test this soon, so more on that hopefully within a month or so. But Joseph, you already have a meditation app that you did with our friend Dan Harris, so if you are hungry for a meditation app, you can get Joseph's immediately, and that is called the 10% Happier. There are a few questions on why one would use an app and the utility of guided meditations, and so we'll talk about that. But Joseph is available to you right now on an app as a meditation teacher. So, Joseph, the first question. Why should I care about meditation practice or mindfulness? Why should I start a practice like this? What am I missing?
Well, I think the answer to that is really very simple. The first time when I went to India when I was looking for a teacher, ended up in India, Bodh Gaya, which was the place the Buddha was enlightened. And I met my first teacher there, and he said something very simple to me the first time I met him. And I think it conveys the underlying reason why we meditate. He said, if you want to understand your mind, sit down and observe it. And I just appreciated the simplicity of that. There's nothing to join, no rituals, no ceremonies. Just the simple understanding that understanding ourselves is possible. It's very pragmatic and very simple, and there's a methodology for doing it. In that understanding of ourselves, we begin to see what creates suffering in our lives and what brings greater happiness and peace. And when we see that, we can make wiser choices. And as we make wiser choices, we become happier. And as we become happier, we make wiser choices in our lives. So it becomes a spiral of greater fulfillment and greater ease.
So you would say there's a direct connection between understanding the nature of your mind, and in particular being able to observe its character moment to moment, and actually living a wiser life and making better decisions that translate into your own happiness or ceasing to suffer unnecessarily.
Oh, definitely. I mean, because we're all a mixture. You know, we all have a whole range of skillful and unskillful thoughts, and we begin to see very directly without an intermediary, you know, the kinds of thoughts and feelings and emotions that are productive of suffering for ourselves and others. You know, we feel greedy or angry or envious or jealous or, you know, a lot of what are called the afflictive emotions. We can see directly and feel directly their nature. And we say, oh, this would be good to let go of. And we see those kind of thought patterns and emotions that are actually happiness producing. But this is not theoretical. You know, that's the beauty of meditation. It's not theoretical. It's not just following what we read in the book. We're actually experiencing for ourselves the nature of these thoughts, of these emotions. And we see that when we're feeling generous, we're feeling kind, we're feeling compassionate, it makes us happy and it makes the people around us happy. And so the choices become more obvious. This is not to say that in the first hour of our meditation, all the old habit patterns of our minds, the unskillful ones, are going to disappear. This is why it's called meditation practice. It takes a repeated seeing and learning to effect the transformation.
Well, can you say something about how being able to observe the nature of your own thoughts and emotions and reactions, merely being able to observe it translates into being able to change course in any way? That's not intuitively obvious that would be the case.
It happens, I think, in a couple of ways. In one very obvious way, we begin to see the difference between being lost in a thought pattern, where we're just carried away in train of association, and we're just lost in the thought and all the emotions involved with it, and it can be lost for a short period of time, and it's lost for a really long period of time. We see the difference between that and being mindful that the thought and emotion is present. So this is a huge understanding, because before people begin some kind of introspection, some kind of meditative discipline, mostly we're just lost in and acting out whatever particular pattern of thought and emotions are there. With meditation or with mindfulness, we're actually beginning to observe the fact that they're there as they're happening. And so that gives us a little space. Gives us the possibility of not being carried away by them. And in that space, we have the choice. Do I want to build on this? Do I want to follow this? Or do I want to let it go? So that's one way the mindfulness gives us that freedom. Second way is what we actually learn from being mindful. And one of the things we learn is that all of these thoughts, emotions, and everything else are impermanent. That they're there, and they're there for some time, and then they disappear. And even though we all know this intellectually, we don't live it as if we know it. We take our thoughts and emotions to be so stable in who we are. So seeing the impermanence of them again and again and again begins to loosen the bonds of attachment to them.
It's interesting to be precise in describing just how much of a change this is experientially when you really grasp the impermanence of an emotion like anger, say. So how long would you say you could stay angry without being lost in thought about the reasons why you should be angry? So you're thinking about an argument you just had, say, and you're not aware of that thought arising. So you're identified with a thought, you're lost in the thought, you're getting angry, and now, because you know how to practice mindfulness, you notice a thought as a thought, right? You unhook from, you're no longer identified with that bit of language or image in your mind. And the emotion of anger is still present because it's a matter of physiology. It arose and it takes some time to subside. It has some sort of half-life. Most people are walking around with the impression that it's possible to stay angry for hours or even days, right? How long would you think you could be angry if you were not subsequently lost in the next train of thought?
I think not very long. Generally, when people are not watching their minds this carefully, may not be realizing that there's a pretty continual stream of thoughts that's feeding the anger. So we may catch a thought or two, see it, release a little bit, and maybe feel an easing of the anger, and then 10 seconds later or a minute later, another thought comes, which triggers the emotion again. Without that continual feeding of the emotion, I don't know exactly how long it would last, but it certainly wouldn't last as long as it usually does.
But I mean, I would put it on the order of seconds, not even minutes, and certainly not hours.
Right.
Like if you were actually completely unhooked from the discursive thinking that is producing the anger, how long can the emotion of anger stay present in your mind? You think you could be angry
No.
for 5 minutes?
Here, this gets to be an interesting question because it's really about then how we define anger. So, for example, the mind changes a lot more quickly than the body, right? Just the rapidity of change. So the feeling of anger in the mind might disappear pretty quickly,
Right.
as you say, but there may be a residue of what we would call anger in terms of the bodily feeling.
Right, the
In terms of the tension,
physiological
the
arousal.
yeah. So that may last a bit longer than the actual emotional feeling of anger in the mind. But emotion seems to me a complex phenomena that involves both the body and mind.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's hard to isolate just the mental aspect.
Yeah, well, it also has the physiology of two different emotions can be very similar, and it's the cognitive interpretation of what's going on.
Yes.
I think this is still known as the James Lange theory of emotion in psychology, going back to William James. Many, perhaps even before William James, have noticed that an emotion like fear or anxiety is very similar to a positive emotion like excitement, and yet it's the interpretation of that arousal that makes for the difference. So when you're no longer interpreting, and then you just feel pure physiology, in my experience at that moment, as you say, it goes to the question of what is an emotion, what is anger in this case. It's not mere physiological arousal, right? It's arousal that has a psychological significance and points to very likely some subsequent goal-oriented actions you may want to take based on this. It's a motive or a set of intentions. And when you break the spell of you're thinking about it and all you're left with is the physiology, I would say it ceases to be anger.
Yes.
It's basically has all the psychological import of something like indigestion or a pain in your knee, or it's something that really has absolutely no implications at all. It's just your body at that moment. But then again, as you say, if in the next moment you are lost in thought about why you have every right to be angry at this person, well then it instantly becomes anger again.
Right.
So,
there's another component of this, which is, and this is kind of what makes the meditation so interesting, because there are just different levels to what's going on. So, so if we can unhook from the thoughts and we're just left with the physiological remains, of whatever the thought pattern was. So then the question becomes, how are we relating to those physical energetic sensations? If they're unpleasant, we may no longer be feeling anger towards the content of our previous thoughts, but we may be feeling, we could say, aversion to the unpleasant sensations that are the residue. So that becomes another level to look at. How's the mind relating to that energetic phenomenon?
Right.
So that becomes another place of investigation.
So the flip side of this, and this is the other question we have more or less on this topic, can meditation or mindfulness be bad for you? Are there people who shouldn't meditate or shouldn't go on silent retreat? And I guess I would add to this, you've just talked about how increasing your ability to observe the flow of your own consciousness reduces suffering, seemingly almost by definition, and gives you an ability to choose more wisely. But is there a period in one's practice where seeing more actually just translates into more suffering or new kinds of suffering that wouldn't be there otherwise? So take both parts of that. Even if meditation is ultimately good for you, are there periods where it can certainly seem to be bad for you? And are there people for whom it's actually bad?
I think for different people at different times, it's not, I would say it's not recommended. Certainly in terms of intensive silent retreat. So something might be good in short doses, but in larger doses may not be helpful. For example, if somebody is really suffering from a deep depression, the isolation of a meditation retreat where people are in silence and not talking, that might be counterproductive. What might be needed more is some kind of engagement with other people, with therapeutic skills. So that would be one area where it would be worth looking to see, is the form of meditation, the right form for what's going on.
And we should say that you do encounter this problem with some regularity on silent retreat, where people who have some psychopathology like schizophrenia get in over their heads, and it's just objectively bad for them to be in
Yes.
isolation and silence.
Yes. I would say that does happen, definitely. Over the years we've experienced that. It's not the common experience. For most people, the practice and various forms of practice work well. But there are these cases where it doesn't.
So then there's the question of, even if meditation is good for you, there can be periods where it doesn't seem to be good for you, in terms of the character of your experience is getting worse by some metric.
This points to kind of a key question in understanding the appropriateness of meditation at a particular time. And it has less to do with what it is that's arising, whether what's arising is difficult or not, because in meditation lots of difficult things come, whether it's physical pain or really difficult emotions, or memories. So sometimes we're really facing different aspects of suffering in our lives. The question of whether it's skillful to continue and proceed really has to do with the quality of balance in the mind, and whether there's enough balance, enough mindfulness to hold those difficulties without being overwhelmed by them, without getting caught up in them too much. I mean, we do get caught up to some extent until we learn how to, create a place of balance. But that's where a teacher can be really helpful, because very often when I'm teaching retreats, and other teachers as well, if we see somebody losing their balance, really getting overwhelmed by what's coming up, we'll very often suggest back off a little bit, and go for a walk, or relax, or do a little reading, as a way of titrating the speed of the material that may be coming up. So it's very much a question of finding the right balance for dealing with particularly difficult material. The difficulties themselves are not a problem. They come up for everybody. But it's really our capacity to be with them, either in a skillful way or not, and that's the key question.
The analogy I often use is to physical exercise. So physical exercise is, in a generic sense, objectively good and basically good for everyone. But if you have a specific injury, if you've got a bad knee,
Yes.
well, then you have to work around that.
Exactly.
And there could be some exercises you just shouldn't do because
Exactly.
it's synonymous with hurting an already injured knee.
Yes.
So there's all of those caveats, and yet you can still say that exercise is good for you in general, and there's a kind of a range of competence where you see, though you will never be, say, an Olympic athlete, right?
You're not talking about me, are you?
Yeah, I will never be an Olympic athlete. I can still see that the same principles by which an Olympic athlete becomes an Olympic athlete apply to me,
Yes.
and will make me as good as I can be at
I think
the
it's a
pole
good
vault. say.
analogy.
And my pole vault is terrible. Have you interacted with Willoughby Britton, a
Yeah.
scientist who
Yeah.
has focused on the cautionary tales of intensive meditation practice, where she thinks that some number of people are harmed by meditation, and we in the scientific community have to understand that more and be less boosterish about meditation, certainly intensive meditation practice, and more honest that there's a potential downside here. I don't know her, and she's someone who ultimately I probably should have on the podcast, but is there anything to react to in there beyond what we just
Well,
said?
I think she has pointed to the fact that in intensive practice, where people are on like a silent retreat, meditating all day long, it can go very deep. We're really going into the psyche, on levels that we usually don't in our ordinary life. So it's a very powerful process, and we're learning things about ourselves on many, many levels. It's not just the content of our stories, which in some ways is the most obvious level, but we're learning about the basic ephemerality of our experience. And when we're experiencing the body as an energy field dissolving, which can be a meditative experience. It can be both exhilarating, but also for certain people, it could be destabilizing. because it's very different than our usual solid sense of self. So I think she's pointing to that level of experience and the need to take a lot of care when we enter into that realm. And that's where well-trained teachers are really important. Because if somebody's not familiar with that terrain, as somebody enters into it, they may not be giving the best advice for how to stay balanced with it. And it's not to say that even well-trained teachers, may make mistakes in offering some guidance, although that doesn't happen so often when people are familiar with those experiences. As I said before, over the years of teaching, and it's something we've learned, and it took some time to learn it, is to know when people should back off, when things are getting out of balance. With experience, that just becomes more clear.
Okay, next question. I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on the use of meditation to cope with negative emotion. This is something we've already gotten into. Is it fundamentally misguided from either of your perspectives to use meditation to make yourself feel better when you aren't happy? So this cuts to really something that falls out of the definition of mindfulness, which we should probably just remind people what it entails as a matter of attention. Mindfulness, by definition, is a type of mere attention to character of one's experience which does not have an agenda. You have to surrender your agenda to be mindful, because your agenda would be subtly or grossly coloring your attention with grasping at what's pleasant or aversion to what's unpleasant. So you have to be willing to just be aware of an unpleasant emotion, a negative emotion in this case, or an unpleasant sensation, without seeking to change it. And yet the reason why one is mindful in the first place is implicitly goal-oriented, because you want to change the character of your experience. You want to be less distracted. You want to stop suffering unnecessarily. You want to be able to make the wise choices of the sort you just described. So how do you deal with that apparent paradox in the moment?
I think this points to an interesting question that I think is coming up more and more these days with the growing popularity of mindfulness, in more secular situations. There's even kind of a movement called secular mindfulness. And it really points to the need to define how we're using the word mindfulness in different contexts. Because in the ordinary way it's being used now, broadly speaking, I think one could define it in the way you suggested, of just paying attention in the moment, being undistracted, coming back when you lost. So just a very kind of simple, generic kind of awareness, which is very helpful. That begins to open us up to a different understanding of our minds. But there are also deeper meanings of mindfulness, which become more significant when we undertake it or understand it as a vehicle for something more than simply being a little happier in the moment, but rather see mindfulness as a vehicle or a methodology for what we could call awakening, or a more profound spiritual understanding, that there's something else that it has the potential to reveal. In that meaning of mindfulness, there's not only a choiceless awareness, which you were talking about, but embedded in the meaning of mindfulness in that context is also, you could say, a discerning wisdom of what is skillful and what is unskillful, what causes or wholesome and unwholesome, whatever words you like to use. So there is the acknowledgement and the understanding embedded in that kind of mindfulness that some mind states are the cause or cause us or others of suffering. create suffering in our experience, both for ourselves and others. And there are certain mind states which are freeing. So already there's a wisdom component, in that kind of mindfulness, which takes us a bit further than simply being attentive to what's arising. It's like, it's attentive to what's arising, but also learning from being attentive. What is it we're actually learning from being mindful? And in that, you could say there is an implicit choice being made to cultivate the skillful and to let go of the unskillful.
Except in the moment, there's another level there where the choicelessness is actually the deeper insight, in that if you can truly be mindful of the anger, say, that was there a moment ago as anger because you were identified with thought and not being mindful, if you're truly mindful in the next moment, then you realize that anger is just as good an object of mindfulness, or the residue of anger is just as good an object of mindfulness as anything else, including a skillful emotion. This is the phrase "one taste"
Yes.
in the Tibetan tradition.
Yes.
So the agenda goes away in that moment of mindfulness.
Yes. It's almost like, I'm not sure I remember this correctly, so you might clarify it if I don't. But that Zen teaching about, in the beginning, trees are trees and rivers are rivers.
First there is a mountain, then
and then
there is no mountain, then there is. It's his Donovan song. Yeah. It was first a Zen teaching, then it was a Donovan song. Yeah.
So things are, first we see them as being ordinary.
Yeah.
So that's the first kind of attention. We're just seeing things arise without this discernment. Then we're seeing them with a discernment of what's skillful and unskillful. And through seeing that, we drop into the level you just described, where we're experiencing everything as being empty. Empty of substance and therefore equal in that sense. It's very few people who can jump to and sustain that level. There's a whole foundation of understanding that makes that possible. And I think in all the meditative traditions that's understood, and in the Tibetan tradition and certainly in the Theravada tradition, there are practices which help to stabilize that deeper level.
Right. So in the beginning of virtually any tradition, I wouldn't say every, but certainly most, there's an acknowledgement that there are certain classically positive mental states that are a better foundation for exploring than the classically negative mental states that just entangle you in your own neurotic misadventures.
Exactly. And that discernment actually provides the motivation for going deeper,
right,
for going to the other level. Because if one is not seeing that, why do anything? And this is, I think, a cautionary note. It's very easy to bypass. Sometimes people talk about emotional bypass, and they jump to a level where, everything's empty, it doesn't matter. There's also, you could call it a meditative bypass. Where, everything is equal, therefore it doesn't matter what I do.
Right.
Or what kinds of thoughts are being cultivated. But that's missing an important piece. Even though we eventually come to the place of what you called one taste, that comes through a very clear discernment, of what on another level we see, this is helpful, this is wholesome, this is not. I think the bypass, and I've seen this, in various, meditators and communities, where people can justify unwholesome actions with the rubric, it's all empty.
Yeah, well, you can see some film footage of Rajneesh's community and get a sense of where that leads. I mean, once you admit to yourself that no matter how much you're meditating, a significant percentage of your time will be spent merely captive to the contents and character of your thought, then it matters what you tend to think and feel about other people, say. The kinds of relationships you form on that basis and all the rest.
So I just want to jump in here for a minute. I think that's why it's important and acknowledged, as you say, in most meditative or spiritual traditions, that there needs to be an ethical foundation to the practice. Because until the mind is extremely well trained we do get lost in the conditioning, of our habit patterns. And so we will be acting out both the more positive and more negative thought patterns and emotional patterns. Having an explicit ethical foundation becomes another kind of support and protection. So as we're about to do something, maybe we're about to lie, or to speak unskillfully. If we have in our minds, no, this is unethical. This is a harmful action.
Right.
Just that, in that moment, can become a reminder to actually pay attention.